It is both a privilege and an honor to welcome today's guest, a pioneer in the field of developmental science whose work has shaped how we understand the growing brain under stress and resilience. Harvard professor Dr. Charles Nelson is not only a visionary researcher, but also a passionate advocate for the well being of children around the world. His groundbreaking studies from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project has continued his work on adversity and brain development and has given us profound insights into how early experiences sculpt the architecture of the brain. Today, I was so fortunate to gain firsthand wisdom from someone whose research doesn't just live in labs. It transforms lives, policies, and futures. Please join me in welcoming the incredible Dr. Nelson.
Dr. Charles Nelson, professor at Harvard University, PhD.
Dr. Nelson, it is truly a pleasure to have you here with me today. As a student passionate about neuroscience and medicine, I usually find myself buried in some kind of textbook or another trying to understand how the brain works. So, getting the chance to speak with someone who's actually reshaping what we know about it is very honorable for me. It's definitely not every day that I get to learn directly from someone whose work is transforming lives and shaping the future of healthcare. I thank you so much again for being here this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, to start things off, I'd love to hear what initially sparked your passion for working with children facing, psychological adversity. Was there a moment or an experience that drew you into this field?
Um, I think I had a long-standing interest in how the brain develops and how child development unfolds, and gradually became interested in the factors that contribute to that, both genes and environments. I then started to work more on the environment side, looking at, for example, babies born prematurely and what kind of environments they hold. I think the epiphany, though, was in the late 90s, I was directing a research network that the MacArthur Foundation funded on early experience in brain development. And we did a lot of animal studies, which is what neuroscientists do, but I had a colleague who was an MD PhD pediatrician neonatologist who had started the first international adoption clinic in the country. And he kept asking me why the kids he was seeing who came into the US, having come out of an orphanage in some other country, often Eastern Europe, had so many developmental issues. And I was puzzling over that. And we had the opportunity to maybe do a study in Romania. This was roughly 1999. And I went to Romania and went to a bunch of orphanages, and it just completely changed how I thought about the world. So I think that was the epiphany, which was to see how a culture could embrace the idea that abandoned children should be raised by the state in these deeply impersonal and profoundly neglectful environments. So I think that was the initial impetus for me to get interested in adversity. And then since then, I've followed that path, but looking at different forms of adversity.
Yeah, of course, definitely. That actually brought me to my next question. In light of those experiences, how did you understand, from like a scientific point of view, how did your understanding of brain plasticity influence the design of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project?
I think that, we know a lot about critical periods, which is periods of development when the brain is particularly receptive to experience. We know this from how we acquire vision, how we acquire hearing and language, and things like that. And those typically transpire over the first 2 or 3 years of life. So when we designed the study, we assumed that the earlier we can place kids into families out of an institution, the better their outcome. And now, 25 years later, that's exactly what we've observed, that children removed from institutions and put in families before roughly the age of 2 have better outcomes than the kids placed after the age of 2. And we've replicated that in, like, IQ is like that, brain activity is like that, so on and so forth. Some domains were not regulated by critical periods, so it didn't seem to matter when you removed them, they got better, or conversely, they didn't get better. And so we're still puzzling over that part. So I think the design of the study was dictated by what we knew about brain development.
Yeah, definitely. I think the consistency of that kind of case study that you performed can sometimes vary as there are individual resiliences to take into play, of course. Looking back on the Bucharest project, what was the most surprising thing you learned?
Well, the most surprising and probably the saddest is how permanent these effects are. So we just finished a 22-year follow-up, and pretty much everything that we observed when they were babies and toddlers, we're still observing. Reduced IQ, poor executive functions, high rates of psychopathology, smaller brains, less brain activity, poor language. And, the good news was that foster care improved many of these things, but it didn't fully remediate them. And the reason is that the average age of placement was about 22 months or something like that. And there's a reason for that happened. We think if we had placed them younger, they'd show more recovery. But we can't overlook the fact that we don't know anything about their prenatal lives. We screened the kids on a physical exam when they were, babies,
Mhm.
to see if they had fetal alcohol syndrome or something like that. But we really don't know anything about the mom's prenatal history, for example. Did she get prenatal care? Was she sick? Things like that. So it's possible some of the limitations we've seen in recovery were contributed to by their prenatal experiences as well.
Yeah, definitely. That again is why these case studies that are usually performed, especially like to analyze the outcomes of these case studies, it's really hard to analyze because there is a set in stone kind of answer, but then again, there isn't in some
Right.
kind of
That's right.
variation. Given how foundational these early experiences are, like these critical periods, like these particular points in time where development is most likely to occur, what role do you think neuroscience should play in shaping public policy, especially in areas like foster care or early education, like elementary school, for example?
Good question. So I think the argument that I and others have made is that given what we know about brain development, we need to intervene as early in life as possible so that when kids are growing up in harsh environments of one thing or another, the sooner we get them out of those environments, the better. Now, that's easier said than done. My wife is a lawyer, and she spent the first 15 years of her career heading up a child protection unit. And I remember I spent an enormous amount of time with judges and lawyers, and to this day, I still can provide expert testimony in legal cases. Convincing a judge to terminate the parental rights of a kid, or convincing a judge to get a kid out of a home and put in foster care is not easy because we have a strong bias that kids should be with their biological parents, that they're best for them. And what I've been arguing is that what's best for the kids is having the best possible parents. It doesn't have to be their biological parents. But as a result, many kids who are in the child protection system, for example, wind up languishing too long in a bad environment before they're finally removed. And often it takes the death of a child to get people's attention that child protection wasn't working. But it's more complicated than not working. It's that there's a bias that we should really help biological parents keep their kids. And that's a noble goal, and it works sometimes. But I will tell you that when substances are involved, like mom has a substance use disorder,
Mhm.
it's very difficult to right the ship.
Yeah. I feel like that really pertains to the environment that these children are growing up in. I mean, obviously, this can really determine their behaviors in the future and their
Right.
adversity and how they experience that adversity to psychological disorders. So, in cases, I actually read your paper in the 2020 of March titled Early Adversity in Critical Periods, Neurodevelopmental Consequences of Violating the Expectable Environment. So, in cases where the expectable environment has been violated, how much potential do you see for recovery later in development?
So if we adhere to the principle of critical periods, well, let me reframe that. We should be using the term sensitive period, not critical.
Hmm.
Critical periods apply to mostly rodent models because development occurs so rapidly that uh, being deprived or having an altered experience for even days is enough to shut the brain down. In the human, it's stretched out a little bit more, so we should be thinking of sensitive periods. We know that there's a peak and then a follow-up where the brain starts to lose plasticity. People often ask, well, based on your work in the media, does that mean we should never adopt a child out of a bad situation if they're 4 or 5 or 6? And I say, no, absolutely not. But just recalibrate your expectations and assume that a lot more effort is going to be needed. So an example that I use in my talks is um, I've been a lifelong squash player. Squash is this racket game for me. But I didn't learn until I was like 19 or 20. I introduced the game to my son when he was 2.5. So I show a picture of me showing him how to play squash when he was 2.5.
Hmm.
Then I show 20 years later a video of the two of us in a squash tournament with another father. It was a doubles tournament with another father and a son. And what you see is these two 20-year-old kids running around the court, and the two fathers are kind of just standing there doing nothing. And the idea is that I had played squash longer than he's been alive, but I didn't learn when I was 2. So if I want to be as good as him, I will probably have to play squash 5 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's the only way to do it. But it's like learning language. If a 2-year-old picks up language, any language in the world, like they're a sponge, but when they're 30 or 40, it's much harder.
Yeah.
So I get a kick out of the people who are paying a fortune and trying to learn tennis when they're 50 years old, which is good for the economy, right? Because they're hemorrhaging money on tennis lessons, but they're never going to be, in the U.S. Open or at
I know, yeah.
major squash tennis tournament.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, my mom always tells me like learn as much as you can when you're young. You're not gonna get it when you're older. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
mom, I will.
But the thing is, you can. So, critical periods don't govern other things like learning and memory. So, and a case study is my mother, who will turn 99 in August. She uses a computer, an iPad, a GPS. She was driving until 6 months ago, a GPS in her car. None of this is easy for her. It's like call a teenager when she needs help. But the fact is, she was able to acquire those skills even in her 90s. So that's possible, assuming there's no underlying neuropathology.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that's kind of relating to music. Like for the past couple of months, I've been taking a course on the neuroscience of music, and what really stuck with me, what I've grasped, is that the music sensations that affect the brain can actually stick with you stick with you longer than a conversation will that has been conversed 2 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago. I know this because through my nonprofit organization, we perform at various assisted living centers, and some of these people can still remember the pieces that they are playing. And I feel like this was because of the fact that they learned some of these pieces during these so-called sensitive periods or when they were in their childhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. She's a professor at Northeastern now, but she was a Harvard undergraduate working with me and then came back as a postdoc working with me. And in her dissertation, she demonstrated that adults' memory for music was dependent on when they learned those things. So, in your case, so you were like what, 16,
Yeah,
17, yeah,
16.
right? Between now and when you're in your mid 20s, 50 years from now, the sweet spot for the music you remember most fondly will be what you're hearing between now and your mid 20s. And then after that, it'll be, your musical taste will change. Like I grew up with classical music, but then my father liked jazz, so I learned jazz. But of course, when I was a teenager, I liked, rock and roll and anything to torment my parents. So we don't know why that is, but there seems to be something about exposure at that point for music preferences. But in terms of musical skill and athletic skill, the earlier the better. That's why they start kids with music lessons and language lessons when you're young. If I could, I adore music, but I have no musical talent. I can't perform anything. So I thought, well, maybe one day if I retire, I'll learn the piano or something like that. I mean, I just know that's just not going to happen. So I'm going to save my money.
I think in terms of the exposure, like what you're exposed to, that really relates. That's kind of like the environment that you're in, right? Exposure, environment, what you kind of gain from that. I think that kind of relates to the psychological theory of nurture versus nature. Building on that, how do you think we can effectively measure whether an environment is suitable for a child or meets the expectable criteria, especially in like under-resourced or at-risk communities?
I think that we need to lower the bar when we think about what the expectable environment is. So um, people have talked about enrichment, right? Enriched experiences. So about 10 years ago, I had a lab meeting, and these are all either Harvard undergraduates or graduates and postdocs who went to Ivy League schools. So I said, what would an enriched environment look like? And they said, oh, horseback riding lessons and French lessons. And I laughed and I said, people rode horses before they had cars, and people do speak French in other parts of the world. What you're describing are typical experiences. So I want to know what an enriched experience was. And the bottom line is it's hard to know. Enrichment is a relative term. If you're growing up with an adequate environment, enrichment might probably mean just a little bit more of something. It's only when you grow up in a deprived environment that enrichment matters. So in rodent studies, rodents that are raised in isolation, but then move to a complex or enriched environment benefit greatly. But if they already are in a middle class rat environment, whatever that looks like,
Right.
then giving them more toys or more rats to play with won't help them. And so the concept of enrichment really is relative to deprivation. But for families that are providing their kids basic needs, emotional support, social support, cognitive and linguistic, challenges, I don't know what enrichment looks like.
Right. Yeah, I think what you said about enrichment and like the expectable environment being a relative term is absolutely correct because it's how we perceive it. It's completely subjective, really,
Right.
which is kind of a hard question to answer. But over the years, completely different topic. Neuroscience has shown us how adversity impacts brain, like the brain's architecture or like the parts of the brain. But on the flip side, what do we now understand about the neuroscience of resilience? How can that inform how we support children in like high stress environments, especially since we're kind of in this ongoing mental health crisis nowadays?
Well, if the question really is what do we know about resilience and protective factors behaviorally, there we're on solid footing. But you preface this by saying neuroscience. We know nothing about the neuroscience of resilience,
Mm,
right? But we do know that there are protective factors. Usually those take the form of supportive relationships. So that's a protective factor.
okay.
So a kid growing up in a horrible environment, but who has a sibling or a pastor or a member of the clergy or a neighbor or a relative who stands up for them, that's a protective factor. Sadly, having a higher IQ is a protective factor, but there's not much we can do about that.
Yeah.
I think that we don't, two postdocs and I, who were both in my Harvard freshman seminar, and now 10 years later in my back in my lab, just finished writing a paper on the link between adversity and mental health mediated through the brain. And we have a small section on resilience. And it's a small section because we just don't know how these protective factors become biologically embedded in the brain. So we don't know how to do that.
Given your research, what do you think are the most promising directions for translating developmental neuroscience into a large scale or real world intervention?
We can do better in the kinds of interventions we design for kids. We can do better in two ways. One is to design more efficacious interventions, taking into consideration what we know about deficits to target those and the timing of when they need to be rolled out. And I think the second is that the interventions could be eventually more precision guided. This is the idea of precision medicine, which is can we develop a targeted intervention? So if in my other life I study autism, kids who get a diagnosis of autism at 2, who then get referred to early intervention services, a subset of them get better and a subset don't benefit at all. So we need to know who will benefit and who won't. And then we need to develop more individualized intervention programs, maybe based on neuroscience, so that when Timmy has a diagnosis of autism, they get intervention A. When Johnny gets autism, they get intervention B, so on and so forth. But we're not there yet.
One last question. What advice would you give to young people, especially students who are passionate about neuroscience and want to use it to drive social change?
First, get a solid grounding in neuroscience, so you really understand the principles. But at the same time, start to identify societal problems that you think would benefit from neuroscience, and as they say, reach across the aisle. Like in your state, for example, because you're in Florida, right?
Yes.
In your state, for example, you'd want to identify people who are big champions of child development and want to do well by kids, and try to introduce the basic neuroscience principles we talked about, critical periods and brain development, the relevant environment, so that they can pass legislation that benefits all kids. Like, for example, getting kids out of bad environments as soon as possible, right? Or improving foster care. Now, I can speak, I probably 7 or 8 years ago, I worked with the Department of Justice. This was under the Obama administration, so I worked with the Department of Justice for 2 years, suing the state of Florida because there were hundreds of children, mostly medically fragile, who were being raised in orphanages in Florida, in institutions. And the Justice Department was suing Florida for a violation of their civil rights and issues of special education. And I remember making many trips down there, and it was sort of heartbreaking to see that in 2020, whatever it was at the time, that people still thought putting kids in institutions was a good idea. I mean, it was just mind-boggling, but it was a business model, and it made people a lot of money. And so that's an example where you can use the training in neuroscience to persuade people not to do things like that.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Nelson.
My pleasure.
Pleasure speaking with you this week.
Okay, take care. Thanks.
Thank you so much for staying until the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed our conversation just as much as I did. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below what kind of content you want to see. Share this with your friends who will probably find this just as motivating as you did.